All right, hello. So we are going to talk about chapter 56, communities. So community, a group of species that live in the same place at the same time, and they have the potential to we see here an image of a plant community. A number of different plant species have the ability to interact with each other, perhaps through competition for resources, perhaps sort of facilitation, and also see it here. We know there's likely a number of different animal species in this community interact with the plants and interact with each other, as well as an astounding diversity and number of microbial species like bacteria on the plants themselves, everywhere, also interacting as part of this community. So the living stuff that is in a particular area. Now, communities can include a huge number of species. I mean, just a vast array of organisms. Very difficult to approach studying it, right? You do everything. So we, as biologists, to sort of subdivide and take a piece of the community to look at, so it's a little easier to handle. And there's three, well, there's a number of ways we can do this, but three common ones is we might go by taxonomy. Right, so we might be all looking at perhaps all the amphibians in a community, right? Or we might be looking at all of the beetles in a community, or we might be looking at all of the birds in a community. So we group it based on taxonomy. Another way that we can sort of group things is based on their guild. So guild, a biological guild, is a group of organisms that uses a similar set of resources, a similar or the same set of resources. So in this picture you see a guild of pollen-feeding species. So the bat, the hummingbird, the bee are all feeding on the nectar and the pollen of plants. So we call them this sort of pollen-feeding guild, even though taxonomically they're quite different from each other. Another way we might categorize or subdivide our communities based on functional group. And as the name suggests, a functional group performs a specific kind of function. So it's species that perform a similar task. So in this image, we're looking at plants that are all capable of a task known as nitrogen fixation, which basically means they can take atmospheric nitrogen and put it in a form that is usable for other organisms. That's called nitrogen fixation. And we'll talk about that a lot when we get to plants and bacteria. So another way we approach looking at a community, and probably the most common way we approach looking at a community, is to look at what we call its trophic structure. So the trophic structure of a community is the compilation of feeding relationships. Compilation of feeding relationships. So whenever you see that word trophic showing up, it has to do with eating. It has to do with the feeding relationship. And very frequently, we represent the trophic structure of a community in an image called a food chain. And I'm sure that you have seen a food chain before. So a food chain is a representation of the sequence of food energy transfer among members in that community. So I don't have enough room. Okay. So we said representation of food energy transfer in that community. So if we look at here, we have an example of a food chain, and we actually have two food chains here. We have a terrestrial food chain. Terrestrial just means on land. And we have a marine food chain. So marine means we're talking about an ocean environment. And there's some very important what we call tertiary levels that we need to look at. I'm sorry, did I say tertiary levels? I meant trophic levels. I'm sorry. I was staring at that little box that said tertiary. Trophic levels. Apparently, I need more coffee. So trophic levels. So let's talk about these. So what we would call the base of the food chain, we have what we call our primary producers. So our primary producers are the organisms that are capable of taking sun energy and organic, kind of organic energy source. So talking about here, so we're talking about something like a plant that's capable of doing this and taking energy from the sun into an organic energy source such as sugar, right, that can be used by other organisms. A little side note here, there are some primary producers that use an inorganic energy source other than the sun. We would call those chemoautotrophs, rather than what plants are, which are photoautotrophs. But we'll get into that later. For now, let's just get the basics. And for the most part, most food chains we're going to be looking at, we're going to talk about some kind of photosynthetic organism like a plant being our primary producer. So let's just focus there. So taking solar energy, converting it to basically energy locked within their biomass. So this little plant is taking energy from the sun and turning it into part of its own, carbohydrates that's part of its tissue, okay? And then that means that the energy is trapped in its tissue and it can be consumed by the next level up. So the next level up is what we would call our primary consumers. And by the way, sometimes I'll write primary as like this. So if you see that, that's primary. So our primary consumers are eating our primary producers. Eat the primary producers. The next level up, or I should mention, so usually we would call the primary consumers are what we would call our herbivores, our plant eaters in the community. So looking at our terrestrial food chain, something like an insect that eats the plant would be our primary consumer. It is directly eating the primary producer tissue. Now we have our secondary consumers. And I'm guessing you probably can figure out what that is. The secondary consumer is the carnivore that's going to eat the herbivore that ate the plant. So the secondary consumers, usually we call them carnivores, they are eating the primary consumers. Which of course in turn ate the primary producers. Now, we also have a level above that, known as the tertiary consumers. This would be an even larger carnivore. So this would be some kind of bigger carnivore that eats the secondary consumer. So think of the snake that eats the mouse, that ate the insect that ate the plant. And then finally, in some systems you just have a tertiary consumer, but sometimes you have an even higher level consumer we call a quaternary consumer. So this would be our top predator. This would be the top of the food chain. It eats the tertiary consumer. So you can see pretty quickly how this is a chain. So we'll get into a little later some of the energy dynamics going on within this food chain, but I also wanted to mention, of course, this food chain is just kind of one isolated series of feeding relationships in the community. And if we wanted to broaden out our view a little bit of feeding relationships in a community, a better representation is what we would call a food web. So a food web is a system of interacting and interdependent food chains. Because the reality is that it's rarely just as simple as this image, right? Because, something like, for example, our tertiary consumer probably doesn't just eat mice. It probably also will eat insects sometimes, and who knows, there's also probably situations where a tertiary consumer might also eat plants. So things kind of get complex very quickly. So usually in a food web, and we're looking at a marine food web here, the first few steps are usually pretty easy to identify, right? Our phytoplankton are our primary consumers, and then we have the krill and the copepods that are the primary consumers. But it gets very complicated above these first two because, again, a lot of times, take something like a bird, it might be happy eating krill, or it might be happy eating a fish, or, there's just lots of interactions going on here and intersections going on here. And it becomes very, very easy it just becomes complex very quickly, I guess is my point. So a lot of times we do kind of focus in on a single portion and look at a single food chain within a food web just to kind of get a better handle on something. And food web biology is like its own branch of biology. There are people who specialize specifically in food web biology, and that's what they do because it does get quite complex. So I'm not going to ask you guys to interpret a big complex food web like this. We'll stick to something a little bit more straightforward like a food chain. But you should be aware that this is a more accurate representation of what's going on because lots of organisms feed in multiple ways in the community and interact with each other in multiple ways in the community. Okay. So another way that we look at a community is by looking at its diversity. And I'm actually going to take a break here, and we're going to pick this up in the next video. We're going to be talking about diversity, so whoops. I'll see you guys in a minute.